Donald Trump considers Voice of America a propaganda machine for America's adversaries, and once he got into office, he wasted no time in dismantling it. Well, at least as much as he could. Welcome to Newspeak. I'm your host, Holly Kellum. So, Voice of America was started in 1942 to combat Nazi propaganda during World War II, and it now broadcasts in 50 languages all around the world. And with Radio Free Asia and Radio Free Europe, Jose Marti, which broadcasts into Cuba, it covers most of the world. It was created through a charter from Congress that required it to be accurate, objective, and comprehensive. It must also present the policies of the United States clearly and effectively, as well as present responsible discussions and opinion on these policies. Now, one of the reasons Trump wants to shut it down is because he says it no longer represents America's interests.
Well, I don't know what happened. I know that Voice of America is run in a terrible manner. Terrible. They're not the Voice of America. They're the opposite of the Voice of America.
He signed an executive order on March 14th, cutting back funding for the U.S. Agency for Global Media, or USAGM, the parent organization for those media organizations. In response, over 1,300 Voice of America, or VOA journalists, were put on administrative leave, according to its director. And at Radio Free Asia, staff were reduced from over 300 to 75. Jose Marti, which initially stopped broadcasting because of the cuts, resumed about 10 days later. And Radio Free Europe, which also had its funding cut, then reinstated by a judge, says its funding still hasn't come through, so it had to start furloughing staff on April 1st. Reporters Without Borders called the funding cuts a gigantic gift for authoritarian regimes in places like China and North Korea, which have been trying to censor independent information for years. China's party mouthpiece, the Global Times, took a victory lap about the closure of Radio Free Asia, but Russia, which designated Radio Free Europe an undesirable organization last year, called the decision to defund VOA an internal matter. The Kremlin claims that there was so little demand for it in Russia that its closing wouldn't have much of an effect. Cuban state-run news outlet Cuba Debate celebrated the Trump decision, calling the programs the most expensive, failed, and corrupt communications projects in the history of the United States. Now, I haven't seen any statement from Iran or North Korea, but if I do, I'll add it to the description. Now, the idea behind these government-funded media companies is that they would bring uncensored information to places where the independent news is hard to come by, mostly in repressive regimes like the ones I just mentioned. But Trump says they're working against U.S. interests by pushing anti-America and woke agendas. He cited several examples in his executive order. One was VOA management telling staff not to call Hamas and its members terrorists. VOA's associate editor for News Standards sent an email to staff saying the Hamas attack could be called terrorist acts or acts of terror, but said VOA should avoid calling Hamas and its members terrorists. That's kind of a problem because the US government considers Hamas a foreign terrorist organization. Another reason it cited, VOA's lack of cooperation with Congress. One Republican congressman said he tried to subpoena information from VOA, but it didn't respond. He accused it of improper spending and cited Muslim watchdog groups that claim VOA Persia was covering up Iran's human rights abuses. Then there was the time that VOA Persia ran a video of Biden produced by a Muslim American organization that endorsed him for president. The video, while not put out by the Biden campaign, certainly looked like a campaign ad. Politico reported at the time that the staff involved were put on leave, but not fired pending a full investigation. And then there were what the Trump administration called its radical propaganda. It cited this VOA report about transgender migrants seeking asylum in the US that was clearly supportive of their cause.
The women hope they can stay in the United States and start a new life away from discrimination and the constant fear that comes with being who they are.
So you may be wondering why Trump didn't do something about VOA in his first term. Well, he did, kind of late in the game, appoint Michael Pack to lead the USAGM. But that was after the Senate slow-walked his confirmation for 2 years, and when he did get in, it was June of 2020, just several months before Trump left office. Now, it seems that Trump at one time had plans to reform the VOA. Last December, he nominated Kari Lake, a former anchor at an Arizona TV station and two-time political contender, to lead VOA. At that time, she said she did think it was worth reforming.
Some people have suggested shutting it down. And with all of the corruption, I get it. I totally do, with all the corruption we're seeing. But I believe it is worth trying to save. with a relatively small budget, along with honest reporting, we can spread the values of freedom all over the world and prevent trillion-dollar wars.
But then, for some reason, she was labeled as a special advisor to US AGM. And then Trump decided to just defund the agency entirely, although a judge recently put a temporary halt to that order. And now Kari Lake is reportedly heading to the State Department, where she says she hopes to continue, quote, effectuating President Trump's mission to modernize and reform the way we tell America's story around the world while protecting the interest of the American taxpayer. While she was at US AGM, though, she said she found a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse that needed to be cleaned up.
I'm horrified by some of the things I'm learning about this agency. And the Biden administration folks who were running this agency before, right before they left office, signed a brand new lease for this building, a 15-year lease that's going to cost the taxpayer nearly $250 million. Here's the kicker. They already have a building that they're located in that is paid off, that they could have renovated or updated. And it's not the only thing we've seen. We are seeing grants where they've taken the grants and they've changed the contracts just days before we got in here to make it less transparent for us to find out where the money's going.
I haven't looked into these allegations myself, but former US AGM CEO Amanda Bennett says the move to this building actually saved taxpayers money. She writes that occupying a modern, space-efficient building dropped our rent from nearly $24 million to less than $16 million a year, and that was on top of $27 million in cash incentives from the landlord that they would put toward turning it into a proper broadcasting facility. Now, I think a lot of what happens next with VOA will depend on the courts. Like I said, Trump's executive order to defund US AGM have faced several legal challenges. And this is, I'm sure, one of the reasons that the Republican-controlled House passed legislation that would prevent federal district judges from issuing nationwide orders. So, do I think this is overall a good move? Well, I'm sure that VOA and its affiliates have had a good impact in places where independent media are hard to come by. But VOA and its ilk have been dogged for years by the criticism that they are no different than, say, Russian state media TASS or China's Global Times in terms of putting out American propaganda. Now, the distinction is that in the US, they don't just broadcast the talking points that the White House gives them, they cover the US more even-handedly, including showing its problems. But you have to weigh the benefit with the cost to the taxpayer. Is it really helping the US achieve its objectives abroad? And if not, can it be reformed to do so? All these government-funded media companies are supposed to remain independent of whoever's in the White House, and what America's objectives are largely depend on who's in the White House. So I get Trump's inclination to save taxpayer money if he can't easily reform it to fit his foreign policy goals. But the other argument to keep it, and I think this is a good one, is that it puts reporters in places where commercial media companies can't afford to, and that means it does valuable reporting that otherwise wouldn't get funded. So I do understand why Trump wants to dismantle it, but I also think this is a win for authoritarian regimes that want to control the media narrative about themselves. But what do you think? I always enjoy reading your comments, and I do try to respond to as many of them as I can. Once again, I'm Holly Kellum, and you're watching Newspeak.